Good day, everybody. Since this is an international program, and for some it will be morning, for some afternoon, and for some it's evening. So I think it's safer to say good day. Let me start with a confession that I am not a healthcare professional or healthcare expert at all, much less about data analytics. And as I was listening to Ms. Tina, I was marveling at the presentation she was making. And she was making me even more an outsider to today's program than I felt earlier. Yes, I have been at the periphery of, I have been a quality professional all my life across various sectors, as you could see from my profile that was read out. And I have been at the periphery of healthcare in terms of setting up a certification system for, Ayush, which is Indian Systems of Medicine, drugs, a voluntary system, setting up a medical device certification system, setting up a yoga professional certification system. And just yesterday, we went public with an accreditation system for Ayurveda trainings globally. So I have been around in a very, very peripheral way. But I'll make a presentation which may not directly be about data analytics, but it contains some shocking data, which, as Ms. Tina said, good data would lead to good policies. And if you don't have data, you would have a problem. So let me highlight something for you, which is from India. It might apply to some developing countries as well. And this is about quality in healthcare. How can we raise quality in healthcare in a big country like India? The international context is that we are in a regime which is driven by World Trade Organization. One of the agreements it has, interestingly, is on General Agreement on Trade in Services, GATS it is called. And this refers to standards and regulations and licensing, etc. for services. And it also mentions certain grounds for regulation, which are health, safety, environment, deceptive trade practices, national security, privacy of data, public order. These are grounds on which countries can regulate. So you will recognize that healthcare services are amenable to regulation and actually should be regulated because they concern health. In the Indian context, the need for regulation was recognized, and the Ministry of Health in India established a Clinical Establishment Act in 2010. But India, like US says, India is a federal country where there are certain subjects which are under the control of the federal government, central government, that is, like defense or foreign policy, etc. And there are certain subjects which are called what is called concurrent list. They can be dealt with by both central government as well as the states. We have states, 28 states in this country, provinces, somewhere they are called provinces. And there are certain areas which are exclusively under the control of the states. So in our structure, even if the main act has been established, main legislation has been established by the federal government, that is the central government, the states need to adopt this act for it to be effective. And unfortunately, after 11 years plus, only 11 states have adopted. And we also have something called union territories, which are governed centrally. There are probably 7 or 8 union territories. So all union territories have adopted, but Delhi has not adopted, where we are located, the central government is located. In the regulation that is there, clinical establishment, there is indeed a good thing for us that there is a reference to quality, which was thought about, and a concept of minimum standards was introduced. And minimum standards, actually, if you go to the website of Clinical Establishment Act, you will find that minimum standards for medical labs have been defined and notified. Draft minimum standards for hospitals are also on the website. But unfortunately, these standards have not yet been enforced by any of the states. 11 states have adopted the act, but they have not yet enforced these standards at all. So they remain a non-starter. While CA is the main act, Clinical Establishment is the main act, we also have some more agencies in the country which deal with healthcare and even regulation. For example, Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority, IRDA, which is regulating insurance, and health insurance is a very important part of insurance. It has empaneled about 25,000 plus hospitals. We have CDSCO, Central Drug Standard Control Organization, which actually regulates products. It regulates drugs, both modern medicine, allopathy, as well as the Indian systems of medicine, which is Ayurveda, Siddha, Unani, homeopathy, etc., which is also an important part of healthcare. Then we have Indian Council of Medical Research, which is actually a research body. But in the scramble for tackling COVID last year, it was given the responsibility of regulating COVID testing labs. So as of today, it's acting as a regulator for COVID testing labs, which are being designated in India. We also have an insurance scheme driven from the central government, which is called Ayushman Bharat, which for foreigners means long life India. Ayushman is, blessing for a long life. It is not a regulator, but it is empaneling hospitals, and by virtue of that, it becomes an important player in the, quality field as far as mass healthcare is concerned. We also have a central government health scheme, which is meant for central government employees. Again, it's not a regulator, but it empanels a number of hospitals around the country for the purpose of treating central government employees, and therefore becomes an important player in the field. Then there are some voluntary mechanisms available in the country. They are called accreditations or certifications. I'm not going to go into the terms. These are actually understood differently in different areas. But in healthcare, accreditation is generally used, so we'll stick to that. So we have, for example, NABH, which was part of the same organization where I was working. I was CEO of NABCB. NABH is a sister board there. In fact, when I joined NABCB in 2006, which is part of a larger organization called Quality Council of India, NABH had just been set up. So NABH was in my neighborhood, and Dr. Rana, who is listed as speaker here, was the first person appointed to NABH. And we sat in the same building next to each other for several years. Then we have Dr. Rana's Quality Assurance, Quality and Accreditation Institute. We also have National Quality Assurance Standards for hospitals, and these have been endorsed by the international body called ISQA. I'm sure many of you are aware of that. As far as medical labs are concerned, there are 4 accreditation bodies in the country. NABL, which is the largest and the oldest one. It has been in existence for several years. Medical lab program came up maybe around 2000, so it's about 20-year-old. Again, Dr. Rana's Quality and Accreditation Institute. There is something called FDS, AS, and GLAB in the private sector. And these are accrediting medical labs as per ISO 15189, which is the international standard used all over the world. Under the APAC of a regional body called Asia Pacific Accreditation Cooperation, where I am a peer evaluator, as was stated. For the certification side, I'm not in medical labs or not in labs at all. And International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation. Added to that is NABH running a certification of medical labs, a certification program for medical labs, which also exists. Now, the question that I wish to raise is, why are we not focusing on minimum standards, and why reliance is not placed on minimum standards in the country? And if the government and the regulators will rely on accreditation, does it serve the purpose of mass healthcare? And that's where the statistics come into place, and I wanted to present these statistics to you. I tried to collect, when this question was raised to a very senior government official in the government here, I raised this question, that why are we relying on accreditation, and why are we not relying on minimum standards under Clinical Establishment Act? And if they are not there, they need to be established, because that's going to impact healthcare in India. He asked me a question, what is the number of hospitals and medical labs that we are talking about, and how many of them are accredited or certified? And then I went around searching for the data, and that's why the importance of data, starting not only in terms of diagnosis, etc., which is far more complex, but even framing a policy, and at the very macro level, we need some good data. And the data that I could collect from an industry body here called Association of Healthcare Providers of India, in terms of private hospitals, is here about 68,000 hospitals of varying sizes in India. As far as government institutions are concerned, some sources indicate that about 25,000 hospitals, as has been 23,582 hospitals. Empaneled hospitals, within those 68 plus 23 should represent the total figure of hospitals maybe. Empaneled hospitals in under National Health Authority is about 23,000 again. Under insurance also, it's about a figure of about 27,000. So that's where we are as far as number of hospitals are concerned. So as you can see, that we do not have very precise data of total hospitals. Roughly, we can estimate about 100,000. I mean, this is Indian term, 1 lakh, 100,000. So there is no definitive registry of hospitals in India. So you can't go at a single site and find out how many hospitals are there and where do they exist. And when we look at the figure of hospitals which have been accredited or certified even to an international standard like ISO 9001, there are about 7,000 hospitals which are, if you look at these websites of NABH, NQAS, QAI, etc., you will come to a figure of about 7,000. So that shows that merely 7% hospitals in India today are covered under accreditation or certification, which is seen as a mark of quality. And rest of 93% are not covered at all, and we do not know what is their quality. And this is ISO 9001 started in 1987. NABH started in 2006, and QAI and NQAS are later developments. So you can imagine if we use NABH as a starting point rather than ISO 9001, because lots of ISO 9001 hospitals went into NABH accreditation later on. So about 15 years of NABH, and we are at about 7,000 hospitals total, accredited or certified. Because NABH runs an accreditation program, runs a certification program as well. Now, when we come to the medical labs, again, an estimate, I mean, even less precise estimate this is, because in case of hospitals, we could get some data when I try to collect. But in case of medical labs, even this data is, that kind of surety is not there. So it's less precise data, but again, it comes to about 100,000 medical labs in the country. Again, there is no definitive registry available, but those labs which are accredited or certified are merely 2,500 at all in this country. So that is merely 2.5% covered under voluntary accreditation or certification. So my question to the policymakers, and something which I have raised, I do have still work with the government, so I am able to raise some question in some places, is what happens to quality of mass healthcare? Is accreditation or certification an answer to quality of mass healthcare? Well, the experience shows, the data shows that even after 20 years of medical lab accreditation in the country, and after 15 years of hospital accreditation in the country, we have merely serviced 7% hospitals and 2.5% labs. And therefore, quite obviously, that is not the answer. And therefore, the argument that I am trying to make at various fora repeatedly is that if our expectation is to lift quality of mass healthcare in the country, reliance on accreditation standards, which were basically to demonstrate world-class healthcare infrastructure. I mean, if you ask, the NABH was started in the time of Dr. Gyani. Many people know him, a very well-known figure in the healthcare industry here. He would tell you that we started NABH because we wanted to promote medical tourism. So it was to demonstrate that India has, even if not fully, partially, in certain percentage of Indian medical facilities are world-class. And so is true of medical labs. We have NABL accredited labs, about 2,000 odd, or 3,000 today maybe. So they can be considered to be world-class. But if it comes to mass healthcare, then you have seen the figures. It's impossible that the route of accreditation or certification can actually meet the requirements of India's mass healthcare. And therefore, the argument that I have been trying to make is based on this data, that the government needs to focus on minimum standards to be laid down or are already laid down or to be laid down under Clinical Establishment Act. And these standards need to be enforced. Otherwise, we will remain largely uncovered by quality. And then you can imagine all the data that Ms. Tina was talking about, where would that data come from when we don't even know how many medical labs are there in the country? Where would that data come from in terms of making good studies and making good conclusions? You can imagine what would happen. So the question that comes is, in a large country like ours with such a huge numbers of hospitals and medical labs, how would you enforce, who would check compliance to these standards? How would you enforce these standards? Well, typical way of regulation has been worldwide has been that there is a regulator who lays down the requirements and who checks the compliance himself. So in India, if it is state governments which are going to regulate healthcare, it is up to them to decide that they can have their own manpower which will go around and check compliance to the standards. Should bodies like NABH or NABL or QI get into checking regulatory compliance? My own experience tells me that's not a good way, and they should stay away from regulatory compliance. That's not their job. They should remain focused on voluntary accreditation and continue to demonstrate that part of India's healthcare facilities are world class. But yes, what they can do is, in their audits which they do, they can, on a sampling basis, verify compliance to the minimum standards which are laid down under Clinical Establishment Act, and therefore provide a reasonable assurance that the hospitals or the labs that they are auditing and accrediting are reasonably compliant with the law. They may not be doing 100% check, but a sample check would be desirable, because none of these voluntary bodies, NABH or NABL, should take the risk that they could be accrediting hospitals or medical labs which are either illegal, not registered, and etc., don't comply with the law of the states, or they do not comply with the essential minimum laid down quality standards. That would be it could be pretty bad, huge reputational risk for bodies like NABH and NABL. Globally also, now it's being done that compliance to voluntary standards is taken as deemed compliance to the regulation if voluntary standards auditing process includes sample check on the regulatory compliance. And other ways which is now globally happening, you can see it in terms of notified bodies in Europe for medical devices, etc., in US for food safety, that you use third-party agencies which are accredited as per international standards from a body where I came from, NABCB, which is part of an international system which accredits certification and third-party inspection bodies. There's a standard for inspection bodies, ISO 17020. It is being used in certain regulations in India today. For example, Food Authority in India has notified food safety audit agencies, and Central Drugs Standards Control Organization has also notified bodies for medical devices, and they are using accredited third-party complying to international standards, these kind of bodies. Where are these bodies today? Frankly, there are none. It's like yesterday when we started the program on Ayurveda training accreditation. Where are the bodies who can, third-party bodies who can evaluate Ayurveda training and certify? There is none to begin with, because there was no market. Hopefully they'll develop. I remember we started the yoga certification in 2015. And for 1 year, we carried out the certification directly because there were no third-party bodies available. But then gradually third-party bodies came in, the private sector responded, and there are now at least a dozen, if not more, certification bodies available. So that's what would happen. In regulations, it happens faster because regulation means there's a compulsion. So the growth happens much faster. So that is the way it could be enforced. So this is precisely the purpose of my presentation here, that when we are talking quality of healthcare and we are talking of data, I mean, in a country where we don't even know how many hospitals are there, God knows what kind of data one can generate and what kind of conclusions one can draw. So my conclusion is that in India, at least, we need to focus on regulation and the minimum standards rather than on accreditation and certification. They are voluntary, they are there, and they service a particular section of industry. Very good. They demonstrate that India has world-class facilities. Very good. But when it comes to mass healthcare, catering to 1.3 billion people that we have, we need to focus clearly on minimum standards, which should be under Clinical Establishment Act. We should have a proper verification mechanism put in place for these standards. And we can recognize, of course, voluntary certification and accreditation if they are auditing, compliance to regulatory standards as part of their process. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.